book. It was challenging, the first one.
Because he wanted to be in the place of love.
Somebody came up with the idea.
And he was 100% accurate in his prediction.
Selenium, iodine, or calcium, you don't have to know any of that stuff. All you have to be able to do is chew.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is usually the climax of the expo for me. And, you know, we've also had some very serious discussions about sexuality, sensuality. We have a really great panel. Actually, this is one of the more really exciting panels. And at the end here, we have Nicloedaedone, who's founder of One Taste, but was also featured in this article in the New York Times called The Pleasure Principle, which was really exciting to get the whole idea of sexual community out into the public and the understanding of what pleasure is and sensuality. And, you know, the media is making a big breakthrough in this understanding, and that's why we are all here, and we can talk about sexuality in a very intelligent way. So let's start with the pleasure principle, and I have a few questions to ask about that because, you know, this is a mind, body, spirit expo, and I'll start with you. And then where does pleasure fit in when we're thinking about our spiritual evolution? You know, when we're thinking about spirit and uplifting, how do we integrate just the feeling sensation into our body? And then we'll go down the line and talk about that. But here, Nicole.
So So I would say that it would actually depend on redefining pleasure, and that our idea of pleasure often is conflated with the idea of heedlessness or kind of losing consciousness. And I think if we begin to redefine it in terms of developing consciousness in a new area, then we can define a whole new way to approach pleasure in our bodies and our lives. And then what begins to happen is you have exponentially more and more pleasure. What can begin to happen if you introduce something like mindfulness into the domain of your sexuality, then all of a sudden you have increased connection in every single arena of your life.
Okay, good. Yeah, but wait, I just wanted to follow up a little bit. So you're saying consciousness and pleasure and sensuality, they're not in these separate boxes. Is that, just go a little bit and then we'll go down, just to give us a little more behind.
So I think, so where I'm hesitating is that I think often we have this idea of pleasure that it's hedonism, or that it's somehow checking out, you know, and we often have pleasure in our lives in order to kill the sensation, not in order to increase it. And we have it in order to kill the connection and not in order to increase it. And so for me, the ultimate pleasure, in the same way, like the ultimate pleasure, you don't have a chez panisse here, but it's, you know, this slow food movement. Like the ultimate pleasure that exists is having a really good meal that has been prepared with a tremendous amount of consciousness. And then all of a sudden you're eating the food and this whole new sensation begins to enter your body. And it's not a matter of just like stuffing something in there. It's not a matter of just dealing with your hunger, but it's actually nourishing deeply.
But let's talk a little bit about this idea of intimacy and sexuality, because sometimes, you know, sexuality is a very not so intimate act. It's a way of not getting intimate. I mean, having sex, it depends who you are and what you do. But it is a very deeply intimate act, but it doesn't have to be. And so anyway, I'm just a little confused about the intimacy and sexuality, and I know that's something One Taste really works with, but we'll all talk about it. But, you know, talk about your sense of intimacy and with sexuality or without. You know what I'm asking? Yeah.
I can work with it. Okay. So our definition of intimacy is being inside of an experience. It has nothing to do with the actual conditions. It has to do with who you are within those conditions. And so that for me is the profundity of mindfulness, is just being with what is as it is, without judgment, without moving into the future, without moving into the past, but just being right there in that sensation without any expectation. Or if an expectation arises, just noticing the expectation that you have. And so often we have this idea about intimacy and what it is. And the idea is actually, it's the very small filter that rests between us and intimacy itself. And so much of what we practice is, it's just everywhere we go, just be with what's there. It's not anything fancy. And you know, one of the biggest things that I had to learn was, you know, I had this idea, you know, sexuality is just, for me, it's nothing special. And you know, I don't think spirituality is anything special either. I think it's the substance of life. And you know, I think it's all special. And if I begin to pull some part of it out as special, then I actually miss, you know, what's right here, right now. And so when I first started my practice, I had this idea of like, I have a sexual practice and it's a spiritual practice, and I thought I was supposed to go to these exalted places, and sort of the kind of everyday mundane sensations that would arise, I didn't actually develop the subtlety to experience for many years. And then all of a sudden those everyday mundane experiences can grow to be really potent and powerful. You know, a lot of the things I just hadn't attuned my senses to know. And so for me, what, you know, probably the best definition of intimacy would be to have an attuned sense to what's happening exactly as it is.
So it's nothing to do with someone else, you're saying, who I'm hearing. Intimacy is not about you and another, it's about you and your experience of the world.
You know, I think it's multifold, and I think my experience is that this pretty incredible thing can happen if I'm willing to be intimate with my experience. Then suddenly, the people who are around me, we can step into intimacy a lot more easily. It's kind of like a field that wraps around people. If I'm just right here with you, all of a sudden, it's easier for us to just be right here together. And then the last piece is, I do think, you know, it's like. You know, it's like, it's funny, I always want to like convince people of this, but like, we're connected, right? And so we hear it, but often we don't behave as if we are. But I love this idea of that we're an open loop system. You know, this book, General Theory of Love, talks about the fact that we're an open loop system. That means that we are not able to regulate our own systems. Human beings, mammals, are not able to regulate our own systems. You know, you have an influence on my sleep patterns, on my breathing, on all of my internal regulation, and I do on yours. And we spend so much of our lives ignoring this fact that we miss the actual intimacy that's happening when somebody comes into my field and they move me. I'm moved by them, and to the extent that I'm willing to just simply to acknowledge that this is happening, just simply acknowledge how deeply you affect me, that's another form of intimacy for me.
Yeah, and you can maybe So, do you want to talk a little bit about the relationship to one's self-practice as partner practice? No, you don't want to. Oh.
I love what you said about the title of the book. I didn't know that it was originally Liberation of Self Through Masturbation. Is that right?
Yeah,
that's
a great
beautiful.
title.
That is beautiful. And you know, I don't have a lot to. I mean,
go ahead.
I don't have a lot
No,
to
but
add
talk
to this.
about.
But I can
Yeah.
say that it was through masturbation that I grew to have a tremendous respect for men, because it's difficult.
To please a woman?
Oh my God!
Okay. So you had problems pleasing yourself? Is that what you're saying?
It's very difficult.
You couldn't even. Well, there's hope.
I would get to that place, and then I'd start to go really fast. And, you know, any man who's willing to take his time with my genitals.
Gratefulness.
Power to you.
That's great.
So then we relate that to intimacy in a sense. I mean, maybe you have, but you know, the self-pleasure and then intimacy is still about that, experiencing that moment. I mean...
Well, you know what I can say is, in Kabbalah, one of the things that's said is when a man knows what it means to be a woman and a woman knows what it means to be a man, sort of this is the time of the Messianic age. And I think that the experience of masturbation, that's really what it did for me, was it gave me like some gauge as to how challenging it is to navigate this mysterious territory that exists down here. and it really did begin to introduce me to, like, when I would feel his finger on my genitals, like, that's what he's, okay, yeah. And it gave me a different way to gauge my experience than I had, prior.
So there was that added sensation to who you were and the... Okay.
And I think it's a continuum, right? I mean,
Well,
it's like there's masturbation, there's orgasmic meditation, there's sexuality in terms of intercourse, and they're all different ways to explore this arena. I was talking with this woman today and saying it could exist, it could be on your arm. It doesn't really matter where it is. We just happen to, for whatever reason, the symbol of my clitoris carries with it a tremendous amount of baggage.
Wait, so you're saying there's no fine line between sensuality and sexuality? Because that's always been a little confusing for me. Where does it go from, where does it get into sexuality as opposed to, so you're just, does everyone agree with that? Or is there, like, when you go to the genital areas, there's an increase in nerve sensation which makes it sexual? What?
Yeah. What?
Here, take.
So we have www, although I'm not supposed to say that, onetaste.us. And one of the primary things that I want to offer is we have this amazing course coming up. It's an ongoing lecture series, and we have speakers like Dr. Helen Fisher, we have Thomas Moore, we have Ralph Steele, who's an amazing Thai forest monk, and all of these people in different fields who are the experts in their fields are coming together and talking about mindful sexuality and intimacy. So that you can find on our website, and along with a tremendous amount of videos and writings and different ways to access our community. Beyond that, we have centers both on the West Coast and on the East Coast. And yeah. Yeah.
That rocked.